I never imagined I'd be standing here alone, watching dirt fall onto my father's casket, while my siblings checked their phones for flight times back to their city lives. At 45, I was the only one who'd stayed. While Marcus became a lawyer in Chicago and Sarah built her marketing empire in New York, I remained on the 100-acre farm that had been in our family since 1923. Dad always said the land chose its people, not the other way around. Maybe that's why I never felt the pull to leave like the others did. The smell of fresh earth after rain, the satisfaction of a good harvest, the quiet dignity of working with your hands, these things spoke to me in a language my siblings never learned to understand. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, some old friends from church, and us 3 kids who couldn't have grown more different if we'd tried. But something strange happened during the reception at the farmhouse. Person after person approached me with the same question. "What are you going to do about the old barn?" Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm was the first. "Your daddy ever tell you what's in that old barn, Jake?" she asked, her eyes twinkling with something that looked like mischief. Then came Bill Morrison, Dad's oldest friend. "That barn's been locked up tight for near 30 years now. Reckon it's time someone took a look inside." Even the pastor mentioned it. "Your father was a good man, Jake. Whatever's in that barn, he had his reasons for keeping it locked. I'd grown up on this farm, but that old barn had always been off limits. Dad said it was structurally unsound, dangerous. We were forbidden from even playing near it. Now everyone seemed to know something I didn't. After the last guest left and my siblings headed to their hotel in town, I found myself alone in the house where I'd grown up. The silence felt different now, heavier somehow. Dad's coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, and his reading glasses lay folded beside yesterday's newspaper. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt right. I poured myself a whiskey and sat in Dad's chair on the front porch, staring across the farmyard toward the old barn. It stood about 200 yards from the house, its weathered gray wood silvered by moonlight. I'd looked at that building thousands of times over the years, but tonight it seemed different. Tonight, it looked like it was keeping secrets. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. "Flight's at 6 a.m. We need to talk about selling the farm before I leave. This place is worth a fortune to developers." I deleted the message without responding. Marcus had been pushing the sale idea for years, especially after Mom died. He saw dollar signs where I saw home. Sarah felt the same way, though she was more diplomatic about it. They both thought I was crazy for wanting to keep working the land when I could cash out and retire comfortably. But they didn't understand. This wasn't just about money or even sentiment. There was something about this place that felt unfinished, like a story that hadn't reached its ending yet. Dad had spent his whole life here, and he'd died with secrets locked away in that barn. I thought about Mrs. Henderson's knowing smile and Bill Morrison's cryptic words. Even our mailman, Pete, had mentioned the barn during the funeral reception. "Bet there's quite a story in there," he'd said with a wink. What did they all know that I didn't? The next morning, I woke before dawn, as I had every day for the past 20 years. Coffee first, then out to check on the cattle and survey the fields. It was early October, and the corn was nearly ready for harvest. Dad and I had planned to start cutting next week. Now I'd be doing it alone. Marcus and Sarah were waiting for me in the kitchen when I returned from the morning chores. They'd let themselves in with the spare key, and Sarah was already making coffee like she owned the place. "We need to discuss the future of this property," Marcus said without preamble. He was still in his funeral suit, though he'd loosened his tie. "The land alone is worth $3 million, maybe more. The development company I contacted is very interested." "I'm not selling," I said, washing my hands at the sink. "Jake, be reasonable," Sarah chimed in. "You're 45 years old, unmarried, no kids. What happens to this place when you're gone? You could take your share and buy a nice house anywhere you want." "This is my home." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed me a real estate listing. "Look at the Henderson place. Sold last month for $4.2 million. Developers turned it into a luxury subdivision. These people are paying premium prices for rural land close to the interstate. I'd heard about the Henderson sale. It had broken old Mrs. Henderson's heart to see her family's farm turned into McMansions with names like Countryside Estates and Prairie View. But her kids lived in California and needed the money. Dad wanted me to keep this place running, I said. Dad's dead, Marcus replied bluntly. And he never told us why you were so special that you got to inherit the whole operation while we got nothing. That stung because it was partly true. Dad's will had been simple. The farm went to me, along with all the equipment and livestock. Marcus and Sarah each got $50,000 and some family heirlooms. It wasn't exactly fair, but it's what Dad wanted. Maybe there's more to it than we know, I said, thinking about the barn. After my siblings left for the airport, I spent the morning walking the property boundaries, something Dad and I used to do together every few months. The fence lines needed work, and there were a few spots where the cattle had pushed through to graze in the neighbor's pasture. Normal farm maintenance that would keep me busy for weeks. But my mind kept drifting to the barn. I remembered being 8 years old and asking Dad why we couldn't play in there. "It's not safe," he'd said. "Old building, rotten boards. Don't want you kids getting hurt." When I pressed him about what was inside, he'd gotten that look he wore when the subject was closed for discussion. "Nothing that concerns you, son. Some things are better left alone." Over the years, I'd occasionally asked again. As a teenager, I'd been curious about everything my parents didn't want me to know. But Dad's answer never changed. The barn was off limits, end of discussion. I'd even tried to peek through the windows once when I was 12, but they were boarded up tight. The only way in was through the main doors, and those were secured with a heavy chain and an old brass padlock that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Now, standing in the farmyard with the barn looming before me, I realized I'd never even seen Dad go near the building. He maintained every other structure on the property, the machine shed, the grain bins, the livestock barns, but that old barn might as well have been invisible to him. Except it wasn't invisible to everyone else. I pulled out my phone and called Mrs. Henderson. She answered on the second ring. "Jake, honey, how are you holding up?" "I'm fine, Mrs. Henderson. I wanted to ask you about something. Yesterday at the funeral you mentioned the old barn. What did you mean?" There was a long pause. "That's not really my story to tell, dear, but your daddy was a good man who carried a heavy burden. Maybe it's time that burden got lifted." "What kind of burden?" "The kind that keeps a man awake at night for 30 years. Mrs. Henderson's words haunted me for the rest of the day. A burden that kept Dad awake for 30 years? I tried to remember if I'd ever noticed Dad having trouble sleeping, but he'd always been an early riser and hard worker. If he'd been carrying some kind of secret weight, he'd hidden it well. That evening, I decided to go through Dad's personal belongings. Mom had handled most of this when she died 5 years ago, but Dad's bedroom and office remained largely untouched. Maybe I'd find some clue about what everyone seemed to know except me. His bedroom dresser held the usual items: old watches, cufflinks from his wedding, reading glasses, prescription bottles. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old handkerchief, I found something unexpected. A brass key that looked like it might fit an old padlock. My heart started racing. Could this be the key to the barn? I searched the rest of the room more carefully. In his bedside table, I found a small leather journal I'd never seen before. The entries were sporadic, mostly notes about farm business. But one entry from 3 years ago caught my attention. "Jake's been asking about the barn again. He's got a right to know, but I'm not sure I'm ready to tell him. Some secrets feel safer buried. But what happens when I'm gone? Will he understand why I did what I did? Will he forgive me? Forgive him? For what?" I flipped through more pages, finding scattered references to the barn, the truth, and making things right. But nothing concrete, nothing that explained what secret Dad had been keeping all these years. The last entry was dated just 2 weeks before his heart attack. Talk to Bill Morrison today. He thinks I should tell Jake everything before it's too late. Maybe he's right. A man shouldn't take his secrets to the grave. But how do you explain 30 years of silence? How do you tell your son that everything he thinks he knows about his family is wrong? Wrong? What was wrong? I sat on Dad's bed, holding the brass key and staring out the window toward the barn. Whatever was in there, Dad had struggled with it for decades. And now that burden was mine to carry. Unless I chose to unlock it. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dad's face and heard Mrs. Henderson's words about burdens and 30-year secrets. By morning, I'd made my decision. I was going to open that barn. But first, I needed to understand what I might be walking into. I drove over to Bill Morrison's place after breakfast. Bill had been Dad's best friend since high school, and if anyone knew the truth, it would be him. I found him in his workshop, rebuilding a carburetor for his old Ford tractor. "Jake," he said, looking up from his work, "how you holding up, son?" "I found this in Dad's dresser," I said, showing him the brass key. "I think it opens the barn." Bill set down his tools and wiped his hands on a rag. His expression grew serious. "Your daddy ever tell you why he kept that barn locked?" "He said it was dangerous, structurally unsound." Bill snorted. "That barn's solid as the day it was built. Your great-grandfather knew how to construct buildings that would last." "No, Jake. Your daddy had other reasons for keeping folks out of there." "What reasons?" Bill was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like he was trying to decide something important. Finally, he spoke. "Your daddy made me promise never to tell you kids about what happened. But he's gone now, and promises to dead men don't carry the same weight as promises to the living." "What happened, Bill?" "Sit down, son. This is going to take a while." I pulled up a wooden stool, and Bill leaned against his workbench. "This goes back to 1994. You would have been about 14 then. Your daddy was struggling with the farm, like a lot of folks were in those days. Corn prices were terrible, and he'd taken out loans against the property to buy new equipment. I remembered that time vaguely. Dad had been stressed, and there had been hushed conversations between my parents after they thought us kids were asleep. Your daddy was facing foreclosure, Jake. The bank was going to take the farm. I remember Dad being worried about money, I said, but I thought he worked it out. Bill nodded grimly. He did work it out, but not the way you might think. Your daddy was a proud man, Jake. Too proud to ask his kids for help, too proud to admit he was failing. But he wasn't too proud to do what needed doing when his family's legacy was on the line. What did he do? There was a man came around that summer, city fellow, drove a fancy car, wore expensive suits, said he had a business proposition for farmers who were willing to store certain items for certain people. No questions asked, good money paid, complete discretion guaranteed. My stomach started to sink. What kind of items? The kind that people don't want found by law enforcement, Bill said quietly. Your daddy wasn't a criminal, Jake, but he was a desperate man facing the loss of everything his family had built. This fellow offered him enough money to pay off the bank and keep the farm running. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. Dad was involved in something illegal? For about 6 months. The man would bring trucks by at night, unload crates into the barn, then come back a few weeks later to pick them up. Your daddy never looked inside those crates, never asked questions. He just provided storage space and kept his mouth shut. What happened after 6 months? Bill's expression darkened. The man stopped coming, left a bunch of crates in the barn and disappeared. Your daddy waited a month, then 2 months, then a year. Nobody ever came back for those crates. So what's in them? Your daddy never opened them to find out. He was too scared of what he might discover. Could be drugs, could be stolen goods, could be something worse. All he knew was that opening those crates might make him an accessory to whatever crimes they contained. So he just left them there? What choice did he have? He couldn't call the police without incriminating himself. He couldn't throw them away without knowing what was inside. So he locked up the barn and tried to pretend it never happened. I sat in stunned silence, processing this revelation. My father, the most honest man I'd ever known, had been involved in criminal activity. He regretted it every day for the rest of his life, Bill continued. But it saved the farm, Jake. Everything you've inherited exists because your daddy made one desperate choice 30 years ago. I drove home in a daze, Bill's words echoing in my mind. Dad had saved the farm through criminal activity, and those mysterious crates were still sitting in the barn, waiting like unexploded bombs in the heart of our property. No wonder he'd kept us away from the building. No wonder he'd carried this burden for 30 years. But now the burden was mine. I parked in the farmyard and stared at the barn, seeing it with completely different eyes. It wasn't just an old building anymore. It was evidence of my father's darkest secret, a reminder of the choice he'd made to save our family's legacy. My phone rang. Marcus. Jake, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe we were too hasty about selling. If you really want to keep the farm, Sarah and I could work something out. Maybe we could be partners, help you modernize the operation. I need to think about it, I said. What's to think about? We're family. We should stick together. If only he knew what sticking together had cost Dad. After hanging up, I walked to the barn and examined the padlock more closely. It was old and weathered, but the brass key from Dad's dresser looked like it would fit perfectly. My hands were shaking as I inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open. I removed the chain and let it fall to the ground with a metallic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet farmyard. The barn doors were heavy, but they swung open on hinges that, despite their age, moved smoothly and quietly. Sunlight streamed into the interior, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. And there, stacked along the far wall, were dozens of wooden crates of various sizes. Some were as small as shoe boxes, others large enough to hold a refrigerator. I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The barn smelled of old wood and dust, but underneath was something else, a faint chemical odor that made my nose wrinkle. Each crate was marked with numbers and letters that meant nothing to me. Some had shipping labels that were too faded to read. Others bore warnings in multiple languages. I approached the nearest crate, a medium-sized box that looked like it might contain electronics. There was a crowbar hanging on the wall, probably left there by Dad 30 years ago. The question was, did I really want to know what my father had stored for those mysterious criminals? I stood there for what felt like hours, crowbar in hand, staring at the crates that had haunted my father for 3 decades. Part of me wanted to walk away, lock the barn back up, and pretend I'd never found the key. But I knew that wasn't an option. The secret was out now, and I needed to know what I was dealing with. I chose a smaller crate first, one about the size of a briefcase. The wood was old but solid, held together with screws rather than nails. I worked carefully with the crowbar, trying not to damage whatever was inside. When the lid came off, I found myself staring at stacks of cash. Hundreds of bills, all 20s and 50s, bundled with rubber bands. My hands trembled as I lifted one bundle and flipped through it. There had to be thousands of dollars in this one small crate. I opened another crate of similar size. More cash, but also something else. Small plastic bags containing what looked like jewelry. Rings, necklaces, watches, all expensive-looking pieces that gleamed even in the dusty light of the barn. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just storage for criminals. This was stolen goods, probably from robberies, maybe even home invasions. People had been hurt, traumatized, robbed of their precious belongings, and my father had unknowingly helped hide the evidence. I opened a third crate, this one larger. Inside were electronics, cameras, laptops, tablets, all still in their original packaging, but with the serial numbers scratched off. Definitely stolen. But it was the fourth crate that made me sit down hard on a nearby hay bale. Inside, wrapped in plastic and bubble wrap, were photographs. Crime scene photographs. Pictures of what looked like accident scenes. But something about them felt wrong. The angles were too deliberate, too artistic. These weren't police photos. They were trophies. I quickly closed that crate and pushed it away from me. Whatever Dad had gotten involved with, it was worse than simple theft. Much worse. I needed to call the police. This was evidence of serious crimes, possibly including murder. But calling the police would mean exposing Dad's involvement, destroying his reputation, and potentially implicating me as an accessory after the fact. The farm that Dad had sacrificed his integrity to save could still be lost, along with our family's good name. I spent the rest of the day pacing the farmhouse, trying to figure out what to do. Every option seemed to lead to disaster. If I called the police, I'd be turning in my own father and potentially facing criminal charges myself. If I didn't call the police, I'd be concealing evidence of serious crimes, including what might be murder. But there was a third option that kept nagging at me, one that Dad himself might have considered over the years. I could destroy everything. The crates had been sitting in that barn for 30 years. Whatever crimes they were connected to, the statute of limitations had probably run out on most of them. The criminals who'd stored them here were likely dead or in prison for other offenses. The victims deserved justice, but what good would it do them now to expose Dad's involvement? As evening fell, I found myself back in the barn, staring at the evidence of my father's darkest secret. I'd opened about a dozen crates, and each one contained something worse than the last. Stolen goods, drug money, and those horrible photographs that I couldn't get out of my mind. But then I noticed something I'd missed before. One of the larger crates had a different kind of label. Not the cryptic numbers and letters of the others, but actual words written in Dad's handwriting. For Jake, the real truth. My hands were shaking as I pried open this crate. Inside, I found a thick manila envelope with my name on it, along with several smaller boxes. I opened the envelope first and found a letter in Dad's familiar script. "Son, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found the key." I've been trying to work up the courage to tell you this story for years, but I never could find the right words. The truth is, I wasn't just storing things for criminals, I was helping catch them. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. The man who approached me in 1994 wasn't a criminal. He was FBI agent Robert Chen, and he needed a secure location to store evidence from a major organized crime investigation. The criminals who brought the crates were undercover agents, and everything in this barn is evidence from one of the biggest crime rings in the Midwest. I sat down hard on a hay bale, Dad's letter trembling in my hands as I continued reading. Agent Chen explained that they needed a location that was completely off the radar, somewhere criminals would never think to look for their stolen goods and evidence. Our farm was perfect because we were just ordinary people with no connection to law enforcement. The operation was so secret that even the local police didn't know about it. This changed everything. Dad hadn't been a criminal. He'd been helping the FBI. The investigation lasted 6 months and resulted in the arrest of over 40 people involved in everything from armed robbery to murder. But then something went wrong. Agent Chen was killed in a car accident while transporting evidence to the federal courthouse. In the chaos that followed his death, our farm's involvement in the operation was lost in the bureaucratic shuffle. I thought about those crime scene photographs that had made me sick. They weren't trophies. They were evidence. I tried to contact the FBI to return the evidence, but without Agent Chen, nobody seemed to know about our arrangement. The few agents I spoke with treated me like a crazy person making up stories. I was afraid that if I pushed too hard, they'd think I was involved in the crimes myself. The letter continued for several more pages, detailing Dad's attempts over the years to find someone in law enforcement who would listen to his story. But without Agent Chen's documentation, which had apparently been destroyed in the car accident, Dad had no way to prove his legitimate involvement in the operation. So I kept the evidence safe, hoping that someday someone would come looking for it. But as the years passed, I realized that day might never come. The criminals were in prison, the victims had moved on, and the evidence was just gathering dust in our barn. At the bottom of the letter was a phone number and a name: Detective Sarah Martinez, Chicago PD, retired. She worked with Agent Chen on the original investigation. If anyone can help you understand what to do with all this, it's her. I looked at the smaller boxes in the crate and found them filled with documents, photocopies of FBI reports, newspaper clippings about the arrests, and even a few photos of Dad shaking hands with Agent Chen. Everything I needed to prove that my father had been a hero, not a criminal. But there was one more thing in the crate that made my throat tight with emotion: a small wooden box containing a medal and certificate. The FBI had awarded my father a civilian commendation for his service to the investigation, but he'd never been able to claim it publicly because of the operation's secrecy. The next morning, I called Detective Martinez. She was in her 70s now, but her voice was sharp and clear when I explained who I was and why I was calling. "Robert Chen," she said, and I could hear the sadness in her voice. "I haven't heard that name in years. He was a good agent. Taken too soon. And your father, Thomas, right? He was a brave man. We could never have made those arrests without his help. So, you remember the operation? Remember it? Son, that case made my career. We took down the Kowalski organization, one of the most violent crime families in the Midwest. Your father's barn was crucial to the whole operation." I explained about finding the evidence and my father's letter. Detective Martinez listened quietly, then sighed. "I always wondered what happened to that evidence. After Robert died, everything got scattered. New agents took over, files got misfiled, and your father's involvement got lost in the shuffle. He tried calling a few times over the years, but by then I'd transferred to Chicago PD and the federal agents didn't know the whole story. What should I do with all this evidence? Honestly, after 30 years, most of it's not useful anymore. The criminals are dead or have served their time. But there might be some cold cases that could benefit from what you found, and your father deserves recognition for what he did." Detective Martinez gave me the name of a current FBI agent who specialized in cold cases. She also promised to write a letter explaining Dad's involvement in the original operation, which would help clear up any questions about how we'd come to possess the evidence. 2 weeks later, FBI agents came to the farm to collect the evidence. They were respectful and professional, and they made it clear that my father was considered a hero, not a suspect. Several cold cases were reopened based on what they found in the barn, and 3 families finally got closure about crimes that had happened decades ago. The FBI also arranged for Dad to receive his civilian commendation posthumously. They held a small ceremony at the local VFW hall, and Detective Martinez flew in from Chicago to present the medal to me on Dad's behalf. "Your father carried this burden alone for 30 years, she said during the ceremony. He could have destroyed the evidence or tried to profit from it, but he kept it safe because he knew it was the right thing to do. That's the definition of integrity." 6 months after opening the barn, I was back to the normal routine of farm life. The corn harvest had been good, and I'd used some of the money to make improvements Dad had always talked about, but never quite gotten around to. New fencing, updated irrigation systems, and a fresh coat of paint on all the buildings, including the old barn. Marcus and Sarah had been shocked by the story of Dad's secret heroism. Marcus, in particular, seemed to view the farm differently now that he understood the sacrifices Dad had made to keep it in the family. "I still think you're crazy for wanting to work this hard for the rest of your life," he told me during his last visit. "But I understand why it matters to you now." Sarah had even brought her kids out to visit the farm, something she'd never done before. Watching my nephew and niece run through the fields where I'd played as a child, I realized that Dad's legacy wasn't just about keeping the land in the family. It was about preserving a way of life that connected us to something larger than ourselves. The old barn had been transformed into a workshop where I restored vintage farm equipment, a hobby I'd picked up from Dad. Sometimes, when I was working in there, I'd think about the secret it had kept for so many years and how Dad had carried that burden alone. But mostly, I thought about the lesson he'd taught me without ever saying a word. That doing the right thing isn't always easy, and sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen in silence, witnessed only by our own conscience. Mrs. Henderson stopped by one afternoon while I was working on a 1950s John Deere tractor. She looked around the barn with obvious satisfaction. "Your daddy would be proud," she said. "He always worried that you'd think less of him if you knew about his past." "He was wrong about that," I replied. "If anything, I think more of him now." As the sun set over the fields that evening, I stood in the farmyard where I'd grown up, where my father had made an impossible choice to save our family's legacy, and where I would continue that legacy for whatever time I had left. The land had chosen its people, just like Dad always said. And sometimes, the people chosen by the land have to make choices that define not just their own lives, but the lives of generations to come. I was proud to be my father's son, proud to work the land he'd sacrificed so much to preserve, and proud to carry on a legacy that was about much more than farming. It was about integrity, courage, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people doing extraordinary things.